Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 2 from the World Chess Championships being played by Anand, the current world champion, and Magnus Carlsen, the challenger, the highest rated player in the world right now. And so Game 1, if you watched that video, was a draw. It was a very short game. It was only 16 moves and it had threefold repetitions. So there's only actually about 14 moves in chess. So going into Game 2, White's now going to be played by Anand. Magnus Carlsen played the white pieces in the first game. And then in this particular game, Black's going to be defended by Magnus Carlsen. So it starts out with pawn to e4. And this is pretty common for Anand. Likes to play this e4. He's had a lot of success with it, obviously. And, it was kind of curious to see where Magnus Carlsen was going to go, and he decided to go for the Carlsen. So playing this c6, kind of signifying what his opening is going to be. And so we see, pawn to d4. This is pretty common. Pawn pushing forward to d5. This is the Carlsen, looking to get his light square bishop involved into the action before he kind of blocks off that pawn chain here with pawn to e6, and then gets his dark square bishop involved into the game, which is exactly what we see in this game. We now see knight here to c3, and then the pawn takes, the knight recaptures there on e4, and then this light square bishop gets involved into the game here, coming here to f5, putting pressure on this knight. The knight's just going to swing back here to g3, attacking his bishop, and the bishop's just going to swing back here to g6. And now the pawn starts pushing forward to h4 on the king side from Anand. So recognizing early on that he wants to start putting some pressure, trying to play this pawn to h5, kind of trapping this bishop here on g6. Also kind of signifying that White's probably going to castle on the queen side. He's starting to really push forward on the king side. You usually don't want to castle on the king side if you have a choice. If you do kind of have all this air between your pawns and the protected king over here. So again, this is kind of a telling move right away that White's going to start putting some pressure on this king side. And so from here we see pawn to h6, just making sure there's a little scapegoat, a little area right here on h7 that this light square bishop can get to. White now plays knight to f3. Again, you usually want to get your knights involved into the action very early on. Again, also this is a very great square for this knight, protecting this pawn here on d4, and also just attacking the center of the board. Now we see pawn to e6. It is pretty common actually to see knight to d7 right here, kind of blocking off the knight to e5 right away. Instead we see this pawn to e6, and then Anand played knight to e5. And there was, people were kind of curious how Anand would actually play in this particular case, and one of his people that he uses, they call them seconds. It's actually kind of their entourage, if you will. Lico actually plays this knight to e5, and so with all the hours and hours and days and months of preparation, you definitely know that some of this may have come in where Lico was kind of telling Anand that, hey, this knight to e5 is pretty powerful because it kind of forces back this bishop here to h7, and now when this bishop comes to d3 and there's an exchange, White's kind of got some time in there, whereas, if we see right away, instead of the knight coming here to e5, let's say we had the bishop coming here to d3 first, and now the bishop takes, now the queen can come here to d3, but White's kind of lost a move here. So it's Black's move now, but this knight is no longer here on e5. So because of these slight variations in how White moves, White actually kind of gets a little bit better of a position by playing that knight to e5 first. And so that's what actually happens in the game. We see the pawn coming here to e6, and then pawn e5, forcing this bishop back. And now the bishop's going to come here to d3, and there's going to be an exchange right here, and the queen's come and takes on d3. Magnus Carlsen now played the knight to d7. Again, we're 10 moves into the game, and if you look at it, you say, okay, both sides seem like they're prepared. Magnus Carlsen had used about a minute of his time by this particular case. So, although we may look at it and say, this preparation is good, Anand looks like he knows exactly what he's doing, Magnus Carlsen wasn't even thinking or blinking when he was moving. He was rapid fire. He knew exactly what to expect. He was definitely prepared for the specific opening from Anand. So definitely looked like both sides knew what they were doing. Both people looked pretty confident if you actually got to see the live commentary. And so we continue with pawn to f4. Again, already we know that white wants to castle on the queen side, so starting to go ahead and put pressure on this king side, also putting another defender on this square on e5. And now we have the bishop coming to b4. This is kind of twofold. One, it's kind of baiting white to see, okay, is the bishop going to come here to d2? Is the pawn going to push forward a little bit? That's really the only options that white had right here. Black really just wants to test the waters, and then he's going to bring, his bishop back, get his knight involved into the game, and then castle more than likely on the king side, but could always castle on the queen side as well. Again, white's starting to put some pressure on the king side, so it could be kind of dangerous if he decides to castle on the king side. The pawn's now going to come to c3, kind of what we all expected, and then the bishop just falls back here to e7. Now the bishop comes here to d2, and this was kind of an interesting move. White could have always tried something a little bit more aggressive, could have tried this, knight to h5. You can sometimes take advantage of your opponent if he hasn't brought both of his knights into the game. So in this particular case, this pawn here on g7 is under attack. Now Magnus Carlsen would never fall for something like this, but if you're trying to think of different ways in your own game that you can start to attack, this can get pretty dangerous for your opponent. Let's say this pawn pushes forward to g6. This knight can now take here on g6, and then after takes, we have the queen come, and then after the king swings over, this is going to be a free rook right here. Again, not something that Carlsen is really going to fall into, especially since he hasn't used any of his time, so he would have plenty of time to not fall for that. But again, just something if white really wanted to add a lot of pressure, he could play this, h5. It really doesn't put him in a bad spot by any means, so he could really start to put some pressure on Carlsen and really have him, figure out what he wants to do. Does he want to move his bishop again, since he's already moved it a couple times? But white decided to go ahead and play for more of a safer route, this bishop here to d2. It's not really forcing the action, but does allow for white to go ahead and castle on the queen side very, very quickly. Now we have black bringing his knight to f6. Magnus Carlsen definitely wants to get some king safety, also recognizing that he needs to get his other knight involved into the game. And now we have castle, and it was kind of interesting to see, which side Magnus Carlsen wants to castle. If he wants to castle on the queen side, obviously he wants to go ahead. He's going to need to get his queen involved into the game. C7 here, b6 if he wanted to castle on the queen side. If he castle on the king side, that kind of opens up some fireworks potentially with both sides castling on both of the opposite sides, and white's already putting a lot of pressure on the king side, so that could be a little bit dangerous. Magnus Carlsen plays dangerous, and he decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. So again, in the game, this was definitely one of those points where we were expecting some fireworks. It was looking pretty crazy. Now we see knight to e4, and this is where Magnus Carlsen, for the first time in the entire match, actually took quite a bit of time. And I say quite a bit of time. He took 10 minutes, but he took more time on this particular move than he had by far the rest of the match combined. And so we see up until this point. So we see knight to e4, and Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and recapture. And then after the queen recaptures, Magnus Carlsen decides to give up more material. And then the pawn retakes right here. White could have retaken with a few different options, but I do like the pawn taking here. It does, provide some additional defense to this pawn on h4. We now have the queen here and the rook here, both protecting this pawn. Black does have this bishop and his queen both eyeing down on this pawn on h4. And also, it kind of blocks off this entire thing right here, and it really just opens up all these free lanes to white to go ahead to attack on this king side. Again, this queen side right now somewhat safe. This bishop's going to have a hard time really maneuvering around. All of these squares that this bishop would like to go to are kind of blocked off because of these pawns right here. So, things were definitely looking good for white. Magnus Carlsen decided to come to d5, and everyone under the sun really expected white to come to g4. Really has all the momentum right here. Definitely be a mistake, this pawn's being attacked right here on a2, but that definitely loses to the bishop coming here to h6. One move checkmate, even if the pawn comes to h6. Something pawn to h5 is just too much for black to deal with. He's going to end up losing a ton of material, and there's not much that this lone queen can do over here on a2. Yes, he has taken a pawn, but that's pretty much all he's going to be able to do. There are some other options that black has. Could always try King over here to h8, making it safe. Obviously, if you have, kind of a pin, you want to get that king out of the way. Could always try something a little bit more aggressive. Could try this pawn to f5 if you wanted to. That could really open things up more than it was before. But more than likely, you kind of have to play this queen to g4. You're the white pieces. You have the advantage right now in the game. The king side is completely open for you to start attacking or chipping away at least. You can start to even push some of your other pawns up the board. But this kind of keeps you alive in the game. If you don't have your queen, you're pretty much just laying down. Unfortunately for the chess community, Anand took quite a bit of time on this move, and then I think he just didn't like where it was going and decided to instead just take with his queen here on d5 and just pretty much exchange, which really just leads to the end of the game. With so many pawns, it's a close game, so these bishops aren't going to be doing too much. There's also no lanes or files or anywhere for these rooks to really get involved. No one's going to do any crazy sacrifice, especially so close to the end game. And so from here, both sides just kind of played it out a little bit, nothing too crazy. And then we see a threefold repetition like we did in the first game, and after 25 moves, the players shook hands and it was a draw. So, started out, in my opinion, very exciting, a lot more exciting than game one. But as we kind of moved into the later stage of the game, it definitely looked like Magnus Carlsen was completely okay with a draw, especially with the black pieces, and Anand just didn't want to fight for the small advantage that he did have. So, game two was a draw. It had some exciting points. It ended not as exciting as we would have liked, but again, these guys, they have one thing in mind, and that is to at least be, if you're Anand, at least tied or a half a point ahead, and Magnus Carlsen, he just wants to be a half point at the end of this. He doesn't really care if the games are super exciting or not. So, again, all in all, game two, hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.